A bitter wind howled through the muddy thoroughfare of Oakhaven, carrying the unmistakable scent of a coming blizzard and the sharp sting of desperation. Out here in the unforgiving Idaho territory, a single night without shelter meant a frozen grave. Jebediah Callahan knew the cruelty of winter better than any man alive. Having buried enough kin in the frozen earth, he had come down from the ridges for flour and salt, expecting nothing but the usual hollow stares from the townsfolk. Instead, he found a woman cast into the street, shivering, her pride broken, and a choice laid bare before him: turn away or risk his fiercely guarded isolation. November of 1883 brought an early, bitter cold to Oak Haven. Frost clung to the wooden boardwalks, and the mud in the streets had begun to harden into treacherous, jagged ruts. Josephine Mercer stood trembling on the porch of the Oak Haven boarding house, her thin wool coat doing nothing to stop the biting wind from sinking into her bones. "And don't bother showing your face around here again until you've got the coin, Miss Mercer." The shrill, unforgiving voice of Agatha Higgins rang out across the quiet street. The heavy wooden door slammed shut with a finality that echoed in Josephine's chest. A second later, the second-story window scraped open, and a battered leather trunk was unceremoniously shoved over the sill. It plummeted to the earth, bursting open as it struck the frozen mud, scattering petticoats, worn dresses, and a silver-backed hairbrush into the filth. Josephine scrambled down the steps, dropping to her knees in the freezing muck to gather her meager belongings. Her fingers were already numb, stiff, and clumsy as she tried to force her mud-stained clothes back into the broken hinges of the trunk. A few passers-by hurried along, collars pulled high against the cold, their eyes carefully averted. In the West, poverty was treated like a contagion. Folks believed that if they looked too closely at another's ruin, it might infect them. Across the street, securing a heavy sack of oats to the back of a muscular gray pack mule, stood Jebediah Callahan. Towering well over 6 feet and wrapped in a thick, scarred buffalo coat, he looked more like a force of nature than a man. A thick beard hid the lower half of his face, but his eyes, a piercing icy blue beneath the brim of a battered Stetson, missed nothing. He had spent the last 8 years living high up on Bitterroot Ridge, coming down to Oak Haven only twice a year to trade furs and timber for coffee, ammunition, and salt. He despised the town. He despised the noise, the greed, and the casual cruelty of people packed too closely together. Yet he watched the woman in the mud. He saw the way her shoulders shook, not just from the cold, but from silent suppressies. She was a delicate thing, clearly Eastern-bred and wholly unsuited for the brutal frontier. He tied off the hitch on the mule's pack, intending to mount his dark bay gelding and ride out before the snow started falling, but his boots remained planted in the frozen dirt. A local drunk, a grimy prospector named Wallace, stumbled out of the saloon a few doors down. Seeing Josephine on her knees, Wallace let out a low, predatory whistle. He staggered over, his boots splashing muddy water onto her ruined skirt. "Well, now ain't this a sight?" Wallace slurred, leaning over her. "Looks like the high and mighty Eastern lady needs a warm bed for the night. I got a cot in the back of the livery, sweetheart. Might cost you a little pride, but it beats freezing." Josephine recoiled, clutching a mud-spattered camisole to her chest. "Leave me alone," she commanded, though her voice shook violently. Wallace chuckled, reaching a filthy hand down to grab her arm. "No need to be proud, honey. A beggar can't be." A massive hand clad in thick buckskin leather clamped down on the scruff of Wallace's neck. The prospector's words died in his throat as he was hauled backward, lifted nearly off his feet and tossed aside like a stray dog. Wallace landed hard in the horse trough, water splashing wildly as he sputtered and cursed. Josephine looked up, her breath catching in her throat. The giant of a man stood over her, casting a long, broad shadow that blocked the weak afternoon sun. Jebediah didn't even look at Wallace as the drunk scrambled out of the trough and scurried away. His intense, quiet gaze was locked on Josephine. "You're freezing," Jebediah said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, like boulders grinding together at the bottom of a river. "I have nowhere to go," Josephine admitted, the fight draining out of her. The truth tasted like ash on her tongue. "Mrs. Higgins demands $2 a week. I have 17 cents. Jebediah studied her face. Beneath the smudge of dirt on her cheek and the wild tangle of dark auburn hair escaping her pins, there was a fierce, desperate light in her eyes. She wasn't begging, she was surviving. "Storm's blowing in over the ridge," Jebediah said, gesturing with a tilt of his head toward the dark, bruising clouds gathering in the north. "Be here by nightfall. Town will lock its doors. You stay out here, you'll be dead by morning." "I am aware of my prospects, sir," Josephine said, her chin lifting defensively despite her chattering teeth. Jebediah knelt down, seemingly oblivious to the mud, and began gathering the rest of her belongings with large, surprisingly gentle hands. He secured the broken latch of the trunk with a length of rawhide cord from his coat pocket. He stood lifting the heavy trunk as if it weighed no more than a bundle of kindling and hoisted it onto the back of his gray mule. "What are you doing?" Josephine asked, scrambling to her feet, her legs unsteady. "I got a homestead up on Bitterroot Ridge," Jebediah said, checking the cinches. "Built a spare trapping shed last spring, insulated, got a wood stove. It ain't pretty, but it keeps the wind out." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "You can have it until the thaw." Josephine stared at him, stunned. "You are offering me a cabin? Why? You don't know me. What do you want in return?" "I want you not to freeze to death in front of Tully's General Store," Jebediah replied flatly. "I don't abide waste. A life is a terrible thing to waste. Ride behind me on the bay. We got 4 hours of daylight and it's a 3-hour climb." She hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had been warned about the men of the West, how they took what they wanted. Yet, looking into this mountain man's weathered face, she saw no predatory gleam, no hidden malice. She saw only an impenetrable, ancient stillness. Above them, the sky was turning a terrifying shade of charcoal. "My name is Josephine Mercer," she said, stepping toward the horse. "Jebediah Callahan," he grunted, offering a massive hand to help her into the saddle behind him. As they rode out of Oak Haven, the first flakes of snow began to drift down from the bruised sky, burying the town's cruelty in a blanket of silent, freezing white. The trail out of Oak Haven started as a wide, rutted wagon track, but within an hour it narrowed into a perilous, winding path carved into the side of the Bitterroot Mountains. The temperature plummeted with every 100 feet of elevation. Josephine clung tightly to the back of Jebediah's buffalo coat, burying her face against the thick, coarse fur. The scent of him was deeply ingrained in the coat: wood smoke, pine needles, old leather, and horse sweat. It was a wild scent, but strangely comforting in its solidity. The snow quickly transformed into a thick, swirling curtain of white. The wind shrieked through the towering ponderosa pines, violently shaking branches and sending heavy clumps of snow crashing onto the trail. Josephine's teeth chattered so hard her jaw ached, and she could no longer feel her toes inside her thin leather boots. Jebediah rode in absolute silence, guiding the massive bay gelding with subtle shifts of his weight. He seemed to know every rock and every twist of the treacherous path. Not once did he look back, but whenever the wind kicked up particularly fiercely, he would shift his broad shoulders, blocking the brunt of the gale from hitting her directly. "How much further, Josephine shouted over the roaring wind. "Another hour!" Uh, Jebediah's voice drifted back, carrying easily over the storm. "Keep your head down. If your hands go numb, tuck them inside my belt." She didn't wait to be told twice. She slid her freezing, trembling hands under the heavy hem of his buffalo coat and gripped the thick leather gun belt encircling his waist. She could feel the hard, unyielding muscles of his back. He was a man made of stone and iron, built to withstand a world that would easily crush her. As the ascent grew steeper, the horse began to labor, its breath pluming in thick clouds of steam. Jebediah brought the gelding to a halt under a massive rock outcropping that provided a brief respite from the snow. He dismounted gracefully and moved to help her down. "Walk a spell," he commanded, his hands gripping her waist and lifting her effortlessly to the ground. "Get the blood moving in your legs. Horse needs a rest on this grade." Josephine's legs gave out the moment her boots hit the frozen ground. She stumbled, but Jebediah caught her instantly. "I can't," she gasped, the thin air burning her lungs. "My feet, I can't feel them." Jebediah cursed softly under his breath. He dropped to one knee in the snow and, without asking, unbuttoned her sodden leather boot. He removed his own heavy wool mittens, exposing large, calloused hands, and began to briskly rub her stockinged foot. The friction generated heat, and a painful prickling sensation shot through her toes. "Those city boots ain't worth a damn up here," he muttered, repeating the process with her left foot. When he was satisfied she had feeling back, he took off his heavy wool scarf and wrapped it tightly around her boots, tying it off at her ankles for an extra layer of insulation. "Walk," he said, standing up. "Even if it hurts, the cold will put you to sleep, and if you sleep out here, you don't wake up." They pressed on, Jebediah leading the horse by the reins while Josephine trudged in the deep tracks he left behind. The physical exertion was agonizing. Her lungs felt filled with crushed glass. She kept her eyes fixed on the broad expanse of Jebediah's back. It became her anchor. If he could keep moving, so could she. Just as the last gray light of day surrendered to the blackness of the storm, the trail leveled out. The trees parted to reveal a high, sheltered clearing. Through the blinding snow, Josephine made out the dark, sturdy shapes of two log structures. The main cabin was large, built of massive hand-hewn logs with a steep pitched roof. About 50 yards away, nestled against a thick stand of evergreens, was a smaller structure. Jebediah led the animals into a sturdy lean-to, tying them off and throwing heavy blankets over their steaming backs. He grabbed Josephine's trunk and motioned for her to follow him to the smaller building. He kicked the heavy wooden door open and ushered her inside. It was freezing, but the sudden absence of the shrieking wind was a physical relief. Jebediah struck a match, the flare illuminating the small space. He lit a kerosene lantern hanging from a ceiling beam. The trapping shed was perhaps 10 by 12 feet, containing only a narrow iron bed frame, a small wooden table, and a cast-iron potbelly stove. But the walls were thick, chinked tight with mud and moss, and it smelled of dry pine. Within minutes, a fire was crackling fiercely in the stove. "It'll warm up quick in here," he said, turning to look at her. She was shivering violently, her lips a faint shade of blue. You get out of them wet clothes and wrap up in the blankets. I'll fetch you some supper and extra firewood." Before she could thank him, he slipped back out into the blizzard. Josephine stood alone in the flickering lamplight, listening to the roar of the wind. She was miles from civilization, entirely at the mercy of a brooding stranger. Yet as the heat from the stove began to radiate through the room, she realized it was the first time in months she felt truly safe. An hour later, a heavy knock rattled the door. Josephine, now in a dry flannel nightgown and wrapped in wool blankets, lifted the latch. Jebediah stood in the doorway, covered in frost, carrying split logs and a covered iron Dutch oven. "Bear stew," he rumbled, setting the pot on the table. "Venison and root-cellared potatoes. Ain't fancy, but it'll stick to your ribs." The rich aroma of roasted meat and thyme hit Josephine's senses, and her stomach gave a violent, audible rumble. She flushed, but Jebediah didn't smile or mock her. He simply pulled back a stool for her to sit. She ate quickly, manners forgotten in the face of sheer hunger. It was the best thing she had tasted in months. Jebediah stood near the stove, warming his massive hands. When she had scraped the plate clean, she said softly, "Thank you, Mr. Callahan, for the meal, for everything. I truly thought I was going to die in that mud today." "Jeb," he corrected quietly. "No misters up here on the ridge, just Jeb." "I cannot repay you right now," she continued. "But I am not a beggar. I can cook, mend, and clean. Once the storm passes, I will earn my keep until I can find a way back east." Jebediah finally turned to look at her. "Why'd you come out to the Idaho Territory, Josephine? Women like you don't usually travel west unless they're running toward a husband or running away from one." Josephine looked down at her hands. "I was looking for my brother, Thomas. He came to Oak Haven 3 years ago chasing silver. 6 months ago, his letters stopped. I took what little inheritance I had and bought passage. When I arrived, the sheriff told me Thomas had died in a mine collapse. A banker named Bogard Hayes told me he could help me invest my remaining funds for a ticket back to Boston. He took my money, told me the investment failed, and left me destitute." Jebediah's jaw tightened. He knew of Bogard Hayes, a snake in a tailored suit. "Hayes is a thief. Town lets him get away with it because he holds the deeds to half the storefronts." "I learned that too late," Josephine whispered. She looked up at him. "And you, Jeb? What keeps a man so far away from the world? It must be terribly lonely." Jebediah's gaze darkened. He turned back to the stove, jabbing at the logs with a poker. "Loneliness is safe," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "People bring pain. You tie yourself to someone, you just give the world a rope to hang you with." He stood in silence for a long moment before speaking again, his voice barely louder than the fire. "Had a fiancée once, Sarah. Brought her out here from St. Louis when I first built the cabin. Thought love was enough to keep a body warm." He paused. "Winter of '76 was the worst on record. We were trapped for 2 months. The isolation, it broke her mind. One night, while I was sleeping, she walked out into the storm in just her nightgown." Josephine gasped. "Oh my God!" "Found her frozen solid 2 miles down the trail the next morning," Jebediah finished ruthlessly. "Mountains don't care about love, Josephine. They just take. I learned my lesson. I keep to myself, and I don't let anyone get close enough to leave me again." He placed the poker back on its hook. "Keep the stove stoked. We'll place the Don't go outside. If you need something, bang that iron poker against the stovepipe. I'll hear it in the main cabin. And perhaps she was meant to be the spark that thawed it. For 3 days, the blizzard battered the ridge. Twice a day, Jebediah emerged from the whiteout like a hulking silhouette of frost and fur to bring food and wood. On the fourth morning, the wind finally died. The world was impossibly still, sparkling like crushed diamonds. Determined not to be a burden, Josephine spent the morning mending her dresses. By midday, she gathered her courage and waded through the snow to the main cabin. "Come in," came the gravelly reply. The main cabin was larger, redolent with the scent of tobacco, leather, and wood shavings. Jebediah sat at a handmade table cleaning a Winchester rifle. "Shouldn't be walking in drifts that high in a skirt," he grunted. "Get them wet, they freeze, you lose a toe." "I am perfectly fine, Jebediah," Josephine countered. "I cannot sit in that shed doing nothing. You saved my life, I intend to work. I see a floor that hasn't been swept, pots that need scouring, and a pile of mending that looks like a bear chewed through it. I may be from Boston, but I am not useless." A ghost of a smirk played at the corner of Jebediah's mouth. Brooms in the corner, sands in the bucket by the hearth. Over the next 3 weeks, a quiet domestic rhythm settled over Bitterroot Ridge. Josephine cleaned and baked, while Jebediah taught her to set snares, read tracks, and fire the heavy Colt revolver he insisted she carry. The silence between them became comfortable. This peace was shattered one afternoon in December. Jebediah was chopping wood when his head snapped toward the lower trail. 3 riders emerged from the tree line. Josephine felt the blood drain from her face as she recognized the lead rider's expensive fur-lined coat. It was Bogard Hayes's chief enforcer, a ruthless former Pinkerton named Gideon Croft. Jebediah didn't run. He lowered his axe and casually unfastened the leather thong securing his revolver. He stepped directly between the riders and the cabin. "That's far enough, Croft," Jebediah's voice boomed. Croft pulled his horse to a halt. "Callahan, didn't expect to find you playing host. Word is a certain destitute young lady disappeared the same afternoon you left town." "My business is my own," Jebediah rumbled. "You're trespassing on a registered federal claim. State your business or turn around." "Mr. Hayes is a concerned citizen," Croft sneered. "Miss Mercer owes debts. Furthermore, she is in possession of property that belongs to the Oak Haven Consolidated Mining Trust. Bring her out, and we ride away peaceful." "Property?" Josephine had nothing but a broken trunk. "Ain't no one here but me and the wind," Jebediah lied effortlessly. "Now, unless you're looking to bleed out in the snow, I suggest you turn those horses around." Croft knew Callahan's reputation, a veteran of the Indian Wars and a demon with a rifle. "You're making a mistake. Hayes owns the law in Oak Haven. Next time we come up here, we'll have a posse." "Let him come," Jebediah said softly. "Ground's frozen, but I can still dig graves." Once the riders vanished, Jebediah went straight to his gun cabinet. "You have something he wants, Josephine. Something valuable." "But I have nothing," she cried. "Just my brother's trunk." Jebediah stopped. "Thomas's trunk. The one Hayes's men returned to you. Get it." They hauled the trunk onto the table. Jebediah ignored the clothes and went straight for a small wooden cigar box holding Thomas's personal effects. He picked up a heavy brass pocket watch. It wasn't ticking. He wedged the tip of a hunting knife into a nearly invisible seam on the back. With a precise twist, the backing popped open. There were no gears inside. In their place was a tightly folded piece of heavy parchment. It was an assay report and a claim deed. 92% native silver, Jebediah swore softly. "That ain't just a vein. That's the mother lode. And look at the coordinates. This claim borders my property right where the ravine cuts through the granite." The pieces fell into place. Thomas had found a fortune. Hayes must have found out and murdered him, hoping the deed was lost so he could claim the land. "They will come back," Josephine said, her voice steady. "They will kill you and take it from me." "Let them try," Jebediah growled. "No." Josephine stepped forward, pressing her hands against his broad chest. "I will not let another man die for this silver. I won't let you die for me." Jebediah looked down at her. For 8 years he had built walls of ice around his soul. But looking at Josephine, brave, resilient, fighting mad, he realized the ice had already melted. He wasn't just protecting a stray anymore. He was protecting his woman. He cupped her face. "I survived the Sioux, Josephine. I survived winters that froze wolves solid. I ain't going to be put in the ground by a slick-haired banker." He leaned down and captured her lips with his. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision of desperation and long-buried need. When he finally pulled away, he rested his forehead against hers. "We leave at first light," he stated. "We ride north to the federal marshal's office in Spokane. We file this deed and let the government deal with Hayes." "But the pass is snowed in," Josephine said. "It's a suicide ride." "I know a smuggler's trail," Jebediah replied. "Pack warm, Josephine. The real storm is just beginning." Dawn broke with a pale, bruised light. They departed Bitterroot Ridge, Jebediah breaking trail on foot while Josephine rode the gelding. By midday, they reached the jagged expanse of Devil's Pass. The wind shrieked like a wounded animal. Suddenly, Jebediah halted. He yanked his Winchester from its scabbard. "We're being tracked." Down in the valley, 3 black shapes moved fast. Down in the Sioux, Croft hadn't waited for a warrant. "There's a choke point ahead," Jebediah commanded. "You ride for the timberline on the other side. You carry the proof that brings Hayes to the gallows. Ride." He slapped the horse's hindquarters and turned to face the riders. He found cover behind a boulder and waited. When Croft and his men came into view, Jebediah didn't issue a warning. The crack of his Winchester echoed like a cannon shot. A deafening firefight erupted. But as the bullets ricocheted, a different sound pierced the chaos, a deep rumbling groan. The gunfire had destabilized a massive snow cornice on the cliff face above. "Avalanche!" Jebediah roared, pressing himself flat. A terrifying wall of white death detached from the mountain, sweeping Croft and his men off the narrow shelf. The roar lasted a full minute before fading into a heavy silence. 3 days later, two battered, frostbitten figures rode into Spokane Falls. They went straight to the federal building. Marshal Arthur Morrison, a man of legendary incorruptibility, looked up in shock. "Good Lord, you folks look like you walked through hell in gasoline boots." Josephine stepped forward, her voice like steel. "I am here to report the murder of my brother and the attempted theft of a federal mining claim by Bogart Hayes." As Morrison studied the deed, the office doors banged open. Hayes strode in, flanked by detectives, a patronizing smile on his face. "I received word that a dangerous fugitive had abducted a deranged young woman." "Deranged?" Josephine spat. "You murdered my brother and tried to leave me to freeze, you wretched coward." Morrison held up the deed. "Miss Mercer just presented a registered deed to a strike your company claimed was abandoned yesterday. Care to explain how you knew about a claim hidden inside a dead man's pocket watch?" Hayes's veneer cracked. The timing destroyed him. As deputies dragged him out, Josephine's knees finally buckled. Jebediah caught her, holding her tightly. "It's over, Josephine," he whispered. "You won." 6 months later, spring brought wildflowers to Bitterroot Ridge. The Mercer-Callahan mine had been leased for a staggering sum. They didn't move to a mansion. Instead, they bought the Oakhaven boarding house, evicted Mrs. Higgins, and turned it into a shelter for destitute women. But their hearts remained on the mountain. Standing on the porch of their expanded cabin, Jebediah wrapped his arms around his wife. Josephine leaned back against his solid chest, knowing the lonely mountain man had finally found his peace, and she, a stranger once cast into the mud, had finally found her home. This story was brought to you by Dustin Hart Western Tales.